Workers arrived in the mountains to drill through an old tunnel that had been sealed for almost 2 centuries. They expected to find only rock and dust, but what was hidden behind the wall turned out to be far more terrifying. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels, jagged and gray against a bruised sky. Wind swept across the ridges in long, whistling sighs, carrying with it the sharp scent of stone, resin, and cold. Far below, where the slopes gave way to a narrow plateau, rows of floodlights bathed the valley in a harsh, artificial glow. Machines hummed and clanked, throwing shadows that danced across the dust. The project site of the new Sierra Madre Railway Tunnel had the air of something half alive, half buried, a steel beast gnawing at the roots of the earth. James Holden stood at the edge of the excavation pit, his helmet light cutting through the drifting dust. His face was dark, weathered, his eyes narrowed against the wind. 20 years of drilling had carved him into something solid and quiet. He was a man used to the rhythm of pressure and stone, of time measured not in hours, but in meters of rock removed. The company had sent him here because no one else would stay. The pay was good, the isolation brutal, and the mountain, according to every rumor in nearby towns, had a mind of its own. He didn't believe in mountain spirits or the curses old miners whispered about in taverns, but even he had to admit that this place felt different. The air here seemed denser, older somehow. It pressed against the lungs as though the mountain itself disapproved of being disturbed. The locals called this range La Garganta de la Tierra, the earth's throat. A fitting name, James thought. Every gust of wind that rolled through the canyons seemed like a sigh from something enormous and patient, something that remembered. Behind him, the camp sprawled in a cluster of prefabricated cabins and metal containers stacked like building blocks. Diesel generators coughed smoke into the night. The hum of compressors mixed with the mechanical growl of drills testing their rotors. A few workers huddled around a barrel fire, their laughter thin against the howl of wind. Beyond the light, darkness swallowed everything. The mountains towered, unmoving, watching. James walked slowly along the ridge toward the equipment sheds. The ground was uneven, still slick from the afternoon sleet. He paused at the edge of the main bore, an enormous scar of machinery and mud, and looked down at the entrance they'd been carving for weeks. The mouth of the tunnel yawned wide and black, ringed with scaffolding and streaks of oil. Tomorrow, he and his crew would begin the deep bore phase, driving a new line straight through the mountain's core. It was the kind of job that could make reputations or end them. He took a breath, and the cold air burned in his chest. Somewhere below, the generators shut off for the night, and silence rolled over the site like fog. For a moment, it felt as though the whole valley was holding its breath. Then, faintly, he heard something, a low vibration, too deep to be machinery, almost like the slow heartbeat of the mountain itself. He told himself it was imagination, the echo of distant rock movement. But the sound lingered in the base of his skull long after he turned away. By day, the project was all noise and motion. Trucks groaned up the access road loaded with fuel and concrete segments. Surveyors barked coordinates over radios. Engineers stood around digital monitors, squinting at seismic readings that always seemed slightly off. Even with all their instruments, there were pockets beneath the mountain that defied their scans, zones of unusual density, and voids where none should exist. The geologists dismissed it as layer distortion. James didn't argue, but he made a note. He trusted rock more than he trusted computers. That evening, as the sun sank behind the western ridge, The air turned brittle and pale. A few snowflakes drifted down, vanishing before they touched the ground. The crew gathered for dinner inside the mess tent, a place that smelled of oil, sweat, and instant coffee. Conversation was tired and routine. Broken machinery, late supply trucks, the latest complaints about pay. But the talk quieted when one of the older drill operators mentioned something he'd heard in a nearby town. He said the mountain had been mined before, long ago, before the war, and that an entire operation had vanished here, sealed up after some kind of incident. No records, no names, just silence afterward. James listened without comment. His spoon paused mid-air. He'd heard similar stories in a dozen places. Ghost mines, lost tunnels, buried treasure. Most were inventions of bored locals. Still, when he stepped outside after the meal, the night seemed to weigh heavier on him. He looked towards the slope where tomorrow's work would begin. The wind came from that direction, dry and cold, carrying a smell of iron and rain. It was the smell of stone newly broken open. He walked to the drill platform to check the pressure gauges one last time. The metallic clicking of the equipment sounded almost fragile in the emptiness. He leaned over the console and felt the faint tremor beneath his boots again, a vibration so subtle it could have been a trick of the nerves. When he crouched, pressing his gloved hand to the ground, it felt warm, just barely. He frowned. Granite shouldn't hold heat like that in freezing weather. By the time he returned to his cabin, the temperature had dropped below zero. Frost crawled along the window pane like veins. He stripped off his gloves, sat on the narrow bunk, and rubbed his hands together. The silence of the mountains pressed close, broken only by the hum of the heater. In the stillness, he thought about the stories. Miners who'd heard voices underground, echoes that didn't belong to their own shouts. He shook his head and muttered to himself, "Rock is rock." Yet part of him, a part buried deep beneath years of rational habit, wondered what exactly lay inside these mountains waiting to be cut open. At dawn, the world was white with frost. Every metal surface glittered under the pale sun. The drill teams assembled in heavy coats, their breath turning to fog. James moved among them with quiet authority, checking cables, inspecting the hydraulic lines, adjusting the cut-in heads. He had a calm way of working, the kind that spread through a crew and steadied them. When the main drill came alive, the earth shuddered as though startled awake. Bits of rock flew from the mouth of the bore, dust pluming into the air like smoke from an unseen fire. Hours passed in the mechanical rhythm of drilling. The mountain yielded slowly, layer by layer. Each fragment of stone told its own story. Bands of quartz and basalt, a history written in pressure and time. James guided the crew through the calibration of angles, making sure the bore stayed true. The noise was deafening, yet somehow the mountain seemed to absorb it all. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt. By late afternoon, the gauges registered a minor fluctuation in pressure. Nothing unusual, yet James found himself watching the readings longer than necessary. When the work stopped at dusk, the crew climbed out covered in dust, their faces pale beneath streaks of grime. A thin mist had begun to rise from the valley floor, swallowing the light. Someone joked weakly about ghosts escaping from the borehole. No one laughed very loudly. James stayed behind a moment, staring at the tunnel mouth. The mist slid around the scaffolding like slow smoke. In that haze, the mountain looked alive, its surface pulsing faintly in the dying light. He blinked, and the illusion vanished. That night, the campfire burned low. The older men traded quiet stories while younger ones dozed in their chairs. James sat apart, cleaning the grit from his gloves. He watched the flames twist in the wind, thin and uncertain, as if the air itself resisted burning. Somewhere up the slope, a rock tumbled down with a hollow clatter. The sound echoed far longer than it should have. He looked toward the dark ridges and felt the same heaviness in his chest he'd felt since arriving, the sense that the ground beneath them was waiting for something. He didn't sleep easily. Dreams came fractured and vivid, a tunnel lit by flickering lanterns, walls slick with water, shadows moving without sound. In the dream, he was drilling, but every strike of the bit sent blood instead of dust spilling from the rock. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the wind howling outside like a living thing. When the morning came, the sky was colorless, and the mountains loomed like gray waves frozen mid-collapse. The crew prepared for another day of work, unaware that beneath their feet, deep inside the earth, there lay an older passage, a hidden scar sealed centuries ago. James didn't know it yet, but before this project was done, he would find that buried wound and open it again. And when he did, the mountain that had watched in silence for generations would finally answer. The drills started up once more, their roar filling the canyon. The wind carried the sound for miles. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for thunder, but up close it was the voice of man challenging the earth itself. As the bit tore into stone, James felt that same tremor beneath him, faint but insistent, as if the mountain were stirring in its sleep. He straightened, eyes on the darkness ahead, and whispered under his breath, "Don't wake up." But the mountain already had, and it was listening. The following week unfolded in a haze of noise and monotony. Every morning began the same, the cold wind shrieking across the plateau, the stench of diesel in the air, and the steady grind of steel against rock. The crew moved like clockwork, their bodies caught in the rhythm of machines. The mountain, once a silent mass, now seemed to hum beneath the assault, its deep layers vibrating with each blow. James Holden felt that vibration in his bones. He'd learned over the years that rock spoke its own language. The sounds it made, its groans, its quiet shifts, its reluctant sighs, told a story that no geological chart could. But what this mountain was saying, he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. By the sixth day, the bore had reached a depth that made even the engineers uneasy. The readings on the seismic monitors began to flicker unpredictably, showing sudden density spikes and voids that shouldn't exist. "Distortion," the technicians muttered, brushing away the anomalies with technical jargon. To them, the mountain was just a variable. To James, it was something far older and less forgiving. He stood near the control deck, the air compressor thundering beside him, and watched the drill head vanish into the darkness of the bore. The ground quivered under his boots. The rock dust smelled strange, richer, heavier, as though it carried the scent of deep time. When the drill stopped for recalibration, James knelt and ran his glove along a chunk of extracted stone. It was smoother than expected, the surface faintly polished. He turned it over, squinting against the sun. There were lines on it, not natural striations, but straight grooves, deliberate and shallow, like marks made by chisels centuries ago. He said nothing at first. He didn't trust quick conclusions. Instead, he pocketed the stone, brushing it off as a sample for analysis. Later, in the storage tent, he examined it under a portable light. The marks were too uniform to be random. They ran parallel, intersecting at angles that almost formed symbols. He remembered the stories told by the old miner in the mess tent, the talk of lost operations sealed off without record. Maybe, he thought, this was evidence of one of them. Or maybe it was nothing, just coincidence layered by erosion and pressure. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been here before them, carving its way through this same mountain long before the first railroad plan was ever drawn. That night, the camp felt different. The wind had died down, leaving the world unnervingly quiet. The crew gathered in the mess tent as usual, but conversation faltered quickly. The older men looked tired, distracted. Two of the younger workers had left earlier in the day, refusing to go back underground after hearing what they claimed was a hollow knocking from the bore. James had dismissed it as echo from the hydraulic lines, yet deep down he knew that echoes in solid rock didn't behave that way. He finished his meal quickly and returned to his cabin. The generator outside flickered, its hum faltering for a moment before resuming. The dim bulb above his bunk buzzed faintly, a pulse that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. He took out the stone again and turned it in his hands. The grooves seemed deeper now under the electric light, as if the surface itself had aged since morning. He set it on the desk, opened his worn leather notebook, and made a few quick sketches of the markings. His handwriting was rough, his notes simple. Man-made, tool-cut, possible old shaft. He stared at the words for a long time, wondering what exactly old meant here. Later, unable to sleep, he stepped outside. The night air was thin and bitter. Clouds drifted low across the peaks, swallowing the stars. Down at the excavation pit, the floodlights cast pale circles that barely reached the tunnel entrance. It looked like the open mouth of some buried creature, breathing faintly through the mist. He walked closer, boots crunching over frozen dirt, until he stood at the edge of the platform. From here, he could see the massive metal frame of the drill, silent for once, its teeth glinting faintly. The hole beneath it was black, perfectly still. James leaned against the railing and listened. Nothing but wind. Then, faintly, too faintly to be certain, he heard something deeper, a subtle reverberation, like the muffled sound of water moving through stone. It could have been the mountain shifting. It could have been his imagination. But it carried a rhythm, steady, patient, like breathing. He stayed there for several minutes, listening until the cold drove him back to the warmth of his cabin. The next morning, frost coated the machinery in a thin layer of silver. The drill crews arrived early, still sleepy, their breath fogging in the air. The foreman from Denver, an impatient man named Larson, was already barking orders, pushing for faster progress. "We're behind schedule," he snapped. "Push through this section by the end of the week. I don't care if you hit obsidian, keep going." James met his gaze calmly but said nothing. He knew that forcing the mountain never worked. It always pushed back. By noon, the drill head struck something harder than granite. The sound changed, turning metallic, echoing up the shaft with a hollow ring. The pressure readings spiked sharply, then dropped. The operator cursed, thinking the bit had fractured. James motioned to shut it down. When the noise faded, a strange silence followed, dense, waiting. He climbed down into the pit, flashlight cutting through clouds of dust. The drill's edge was buried against a surface smoother than any rock he'd seen in this region. He wiped away the dust with his glove and froze. Beneath the grime was a flat plane of pale gray stone, its texture uniform, almost polished. Running across it were faint linear patterns, tool marks, deliberate and rhythmic, forming a grid. He stepped back slowly. It wasn't natural. He'd seen this kind of pattern once before, in a collapsed mining tunnel in Utah, an old colonial structure sealed after a methane explosion. But this was deeper, older. The air that seeped through the cracks smelled ancient, dry and metallic, carrying the faint scent of rust and something else, something that made the back of his throat tighten. He turned off his light for a moment, standing in darkness. The silence was total. It was as though the mountain itself was holding its breath again, just as it had that first night. Back on the surface, Larson demanded a report. James gave him the bare facts. "We've hit an artificial obstruction. Man-made. Unknown composition." Larson frowned. "Probably an old shaft. Blast through it tomorrow." James didn't argue, but his gut twisted. He knew this wasn't just a forgotten tunnel. The precision of the surface, the way the air shifted when they touched it, it all felt deliberate. Someone had wanted this sealed. That evening, James sat by the fire with a mug of bitter coffee, staring into the flames. Around him, the others talked in low voices, the words half lost to the wind. One of them mentioned the grooves in the stone, said they looked like doors, like a wall built to keep something in. Another laughed nervously, calling it superstition. James didn't join in. He thought about the smoothness of that surface, the way the sound of the drill had changed the moment it touched it. Rock had resonance. It remembered what it had been used for, and that tone, it had sounded too much like a hollow drum. He retired to his cabin, but sleep refused him again. The wind outside rose and fell in waves, moaning across the ridges. He dreamed of corridors beneath the earth, of a faint light flickering behind a wall of stone, of hands, dozens of them, pressing outward from the other side. He woke before dawn, the heater humming quietly beside his bed. His hands were trembling. He couldn't tell if it was the cold or something else. At sunrise, the first shafts of light pierced through the mist, painting the peaks gold. The crew assembled reluctantly, their movements slow and heavy. James inspected the site alone before the others arrived. The section where they had stopped drilling looked untouched, as though the night had erased all evidence of their work. He ran his hand across the cold stone, tracing one of the grooves with his fingers. It was sharp, clean, too precise to have been carved by crude tools. Beneath the groove, the rock vibrated faintly, almost imperceptibly, like something behind it was still alive. He stepped back and looked toward the distant ridges. They stood silent, massive, immutable. But in that silence he sensed something waiting, a history buried too deep to be remembered and too deliberate to be accidental. The mountain had given them a glimpse, and now it seemed to be listening again, deciding whether to reveal the rest. When the crew arrived, James said nothing about what he'd felt. He gave the standard instructions, his tone steady, his eyes distant. Yet, all day long, as the drills roared and the earth shuddered, he couldn't shake the thought that they weren't carving new ground. They were reopening something that had been closed for a reason. That night, as the wind howled through the camp and the generators rattled against the cold, James sat alone in his cabin and stared at the map spread before him. The topography of the range was marked in neat lines and measurements, but in the center, where they were digging, there was a blank, an unrecorded void between two surveyed ridges. No data, no geological record, just emptiness. He traced it with his pencil, pressing until the point broke. Outside, the mountains loomed in darkness, their shapes merging with the sky. The silence between gusts of wind was vast, almost sentient. James turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum beneath the floor. When he finally lay back on the narrow bed, he could still feel the vibration through the metal frame. He closed his eyes and thought of the smooth wall buried under tons of rock, waiting. Whatever lay behind it had been sealed long before his time, long before the age of machines. But tomorrow, under orders, they would drill through it. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, one last thought came to him, quiet and cold as the mountain air itself. Sometimes, when you dig deep enough, it's not discovery that waits, it's memory. The third morning dawned heavy and gray. The sky pressed low over the peaks as if the weather itself wished to keep what lay inside the mountain hidden. The crew moved slowly, their voices subdued, the usual morning chatter absent. The metallic rhythm of tools against frozen metal echoed through the camp like reluctant heartbeats. James Holden stood by the tunnel mouth, coffee cooling in his gloved hand, watching the mist curl through the scaffolding and into the dark borehole. Somewhere in the depths of that darkness lay the smooth wall they had uncovered the day before, a wall that was not natural, not geological, not right. He had not slept much. The image of that flat gray surface haunted him. He could still smell the strange air that had escaped through the cracks, dry, sharp, carrying the faintest undertone of burned oil and decay. It was not the smell of sealed stone, but of something long enclosed, long forgotten. When he had finally drifted into sleep, he dreamed of hands scraping at rock, of a faint light glimmering behind a sealed doorway. He awoke with the sense that the mountain itself had been watching him. Larson, the Denver foreman, arrived just after sunrise, already shouting orders. He wanted the wall open today. The geologists had sent word that the obstruction was likely a remnant of early 19th century mining activity, perhaps a collapsed shaft. "We'll drill through, sample the material, clear the debris," Larson said, lighting a cigarette and blowing smoke into the wind. "Let's not turn this into folklore." James said nothing. He'd learned long ago that arguing with men like Larson was a waste of breath. Instead, he focused on preparing the equipment, checking the air compressors, tightening the hydraulic couplings, running diagnostics on the cutting head. He moved with deliberate precision, the way a surgeon prepares for an operation he knows will go wrong. When everything was ready, he gave a curt nod to the operator and the drill came alive with a roar that drowned out the morning. The vibration ran through the ground like thunder rolling through bone. Dust rose from the bore in thick gray plumes. The sound was not the steady growl of rock breaking. It was sharper, hollower, like the drill was striking against something that wanted to resist. Every few seconds, the pressure gauges spiked wildly. James stood close, watching the readings. "Ease off," he said into the radio. "She's flexing too much." But the machine kept pushing. Larson's voice crackled back. "We're not here to baby the mountain, Holden. Keep drilling." After 40 minutes, the first crack appeared. A sliver of light gray dust puffed from the bore, followed by a hiss of air. The men stepped back instinctively. James felt the temperature drop around them. A faint whistle began, soft, continuous, almost melodic, as if air were being drawn through narrow teeth. "Shut it down," James ordered. The operator killed the engine and the whistle faded, leaving a silence that rang louder than any noise. They waited. The dust settled slowly, revealing a thin fissure running across the surface of the exposed wall. Through that fissure seeped a current of air, cold and stale, carrying a smell like old metal and soot. It was not the scent of ordinary earth. James knelt, shining his light along the crack. The stone looked less like rock now and more like fused concrete, a seal, dense and layered. He ran his glove along the surface, feeling its smoothness. It had been poured, not formed. "This isn't collapse debris," he murmured. "Someone built this." Larson crouched beside him, squinting. "Built it? For what?" James didn't answer. He tapped the surface gently with the handle of his wrench. The sound it made was hollow. Behind this barrier, there was space. Empty space. That night, the camp was quieter than ever. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before passing over the valley. The fog had returned, rolling low and slow, blurring the edges of the world. Around the campfire, a few of the younger workers spoke in hushed tones, their faces drawn and pale. One of them claimed he had heard knocking from inside the tunnel after the drill stopped. Another swore he'd seen movement in the mist near the ridge. Larson dismissed it all with his usual scorn, but the men's nerves were frayed. The mountain had become something more than a work site. It was a presence now, a thing that listened. James sat apart, close to the tunnel entrance. He could see the faint outline of the sealed wall from where he sat, a pale circle inside the darkness. He thought about the marks on the stone, the symmetry of the grooves. They reminded him of ancient craftsmanship, like something built with purpose, not desperation. He wondered who had made it, and why they had gone to such lengths to close it off. The fire cracked behind him. Carter, one of the older drillers, walked over, his breath steaming in the cold. "You've seen a lot of rock in your time," he said quietly. "You ever seen anything like that?" James shook his head. "Not like that. Whatever's behind it, it's been there a long time." Carter nodded, staring into the dark hole. "Then maybe it should stay there." Neither man spoke again. The fog thickened, swallowing the camp in pale gray silence. When James finally returned to his cabin, he found that the lights inside flickered as he entered, dimming for a moment before stabilizing. He rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy. He could still feel the hum of the mountain under his feet, faint and pulsing, like a heartbeat buried deep in the stone. He dreamed again that night. This time, the dream was clearer. He stood in a tunnel lit by a single flickering lamp. The walls were covered in black soot and marks that looked like claw scratches. Ahead of him stood the gray wall, and from behind it came a muffled rhythm. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. Then silence. When he awoke, the knocking continued faintly in his mind, echoing with each beat of his heart. Morning came with freezing rain. The drill rig gleamed wet and slick under the lights. Larson was already pacing by the controls, impatient to begin. "We'll break through today," he said. "Finish the section and get this report to Denver." The men obeyed reluctantly. No one spoke as the machine started up again, its whine building into a roar that shook the scaffolding. James stayed close, monitoring the readings. The vibration felt wrong, uneven, shifting between resistance and sudden hollowness. Then, with a deep, splitting sound, the wall fractured. Dust exploded outward, coating everything in a fine gray layer. Through the haze, James saw a narrow seam opening across the surface. Air rushed out, colder than before, sharp enough to sting his face. It carried with it the smell of rust and something older, something faintly organic. "Shut it down," he shouted. The machine fell silent. The only sound the hiss of air from the new breach. The fissure widened by itself, stones cracking with slow groans. Something inside the mountain exhaled. When the dust cleared, the wall stood revealed, a broad slab of fused stone, now webbed with fractures. James approached cautiously. The cracks were wide enough to see through in places, though only darkness lay beyond. He pressed his gloved hand against the surface and felt it vibrating faintly. The temperature dropped another degree. It was like touching the skin of something alive. Larson moved up beside him. "We're through tomorrow," he said flatly. "Full penetration. No delays." James didn't look away from the wall. "It's not just rock," he said. "This is man-made. Look at the layering. It's poured, sealed, reinforced. Someone closed this on purpose." "Then we're reopening it on purpose," Larson replied, turning away. When the foreman left, James stayed behind, staring at the cracks until the lights dimmed. He thought he saw movement deep inside the fissure, a shift like dust swirling where no air should move. He blinked, and it was gone. By nightfall, the rain turned to sleet. The camp was a smear of light and noise in the vast gray landscape. James couldn't eat. He kept thinking about the texture of that wall, about the way the mountains seemed to breathe each time they broke through another layer. It was as if they were peeling back the skin of something that had been asleep for centuries. He felt no triumph in the work now, only unease. Before turning in, he walked once more to the tunnel. The floodlights illuminated the entrance in a halo of mist. He stood there for a long time, listening. No drills, no voices, just the faint drip of melting sleet from the steel beams. Then, deep inside the bore, he heard it again, a sound so soft he almost doubted it. A single knock, then another, then silence. He backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the darkness, and whispered to no one, "We shouldn't be doing this." The mountain did not answer, but the air shifted as if in response. Somewhere beneath the seal, pressure built and released, the faint echo of movement traveling through tons of stone. Whatever was behind that wall had waited a long time, and now, as men and machines tore at its prison, it was beginning to stir. When James finally returned to his cabin, the wind had died completely. The world outside was still. In that unnatural quiet, the memory of the hollow knocks followed him, keeping rhythm with his own heartbeat until sleep finally took him, shallow and uneasy. By morning, he would forget the sound's pattern, but not its meaning. Something old had awakened, and the mountain had begun to remember. At dawn, the fog had thickened so heavily that the mountains were little more than shifting shadows. The valley lay drowned in silence, as if the whole landscape had been sealed under glass. The rain from the night before had frozen into a thin film of ice that cracked under the men's boots as they trudged toward the tunnel. The generator lights flickered weakly in the mist, throwing pale reflections against the metal frames. James Holden led the crew in silence. None of them spoke of the sound that had echoed from the borehole the previous night, but each man had heard it, the steady, deliberate knocks that came from beyond the sealed wall. No one wanted to believe it had been real. The air near the tunnel entrance was sharper now, almost metallic. It carried a dryness that felt wrong, as though it had been trapped for too long. The seal in the rock was no longer a smooth surface, but a fractured mosaic of gray slabs veined with dust. The cold breath that seeped from its cracks bit at the men's faces. The atmosphere was taut, like the air before a storm. Larson arrived late, his jacket dripping with melted frost, irritation already on his face. "We're finishing this today," he said. "One push, then we move to reinforcement. I don't want another day wasted on superstitions." James said nothing. He adjusted his gloves, his eyes fixed on the cracked wall. He knew they would break through. The mountain would not hold them back much longer. Yet, the closer they came to doing it, the more a quiet dread settled in his chest. It was the kind of instinct that years underground had sharpened, the sense that sometimes stone itself warned you to stop. The drill roared to life, its vibrations echoing deep into the mountain's gut. The crew worked mechanically, their faces set in grim concentration. Dust churned into the air, thick and gray. The first few minutes passed in the usual rhythm of grinding and rumbling. But then the sound changed. The resistance dropped suddenly, the machine jerking as if it had hit a hollow space. James stepped forward and raised his hand. "Power down," he shouted. The operator hesitated, then killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense. Dust drifted in slow spirals, settling like snow. Then came a faint sound from inside the wall, like a sigh escaping through the stone. A small piece of rock gave way, tumbling onto the ground. Behind it, darkness breathed. James approached cautiously, pulling his flashlight from his belt. He shone it into the gap. At first, there was only blackness, the beam swallowed whole. Then, as the dust thinned, he saw depth, a void stretching beyond the broken wall. The air that poured out was cold and dry, stinking faintly of rust and decay. He could taste it on his tongue. "Cut the rest manually," he said. "Slow." They used crowbars and chisels this time, peeling away the fractured stone layer by layer. Each slab that fell revealed more of the opening, an arched passage barely wide enough for a man to walk through. When the final stone clattered onto the floor, the passage yawned before them, a dark throat leading into the mountain's heart. No one spoke. The lamps on their helmets flickered across rough, soot-streaked walls. Moisture glimmered in the beam of the light, though the air was dry as bone. James felt the weight of centuries pressing in around them. He turned to the crew. "I'll go first. Keep the line tight. Watch your step." He crouched and stepped through the opening. The ground beneath his boots was uneven, covered in a mix of gravel, splintered wood, and what looked like rusted metal fragments. The air grew colder as he moved forward, and the smell intensified. Iron, dust, and something faintly organic. His flashlight trembled slightly as he swept it across the tunnel. Wooden beams supported the ceiling, though most had rotted to thin splinters. Some still held the charred marks of fire. The walls bore deep gouges, too deliberate to be natural fractures. The others followed slowly. Their lights joined his, revealing more of the corridor. Old tools lay scattered across the ground. Pickaxes with missing handles, shattered lanterns, a dented tin can half buried in dust. James crouched beside one and brushed the grime away. The surface of the metal was blackened, but he could still make out faint letters scratched by hand. The markings were clumsy, but one word stood out clearly. "Wait." He rose and looked farther down the passage. The tunnel widened into a chamber. As they stepped inside, the light from their helmets converged on something that made all of them stop breathing. Against the far wall sat a cluster of human forms, their bones bleached white and fragile, wrapped in the remnants of what had once been fabric. They were positioned upright, huddled together, arms drawn in close as if seeking warmth. The empty sockets of their skulls reflected the beams of light like glass. For a long time, no one moved. The sound of dripping water somewhere deep in the mountain echoed faintly, a rhythm older than memory. James took a step forward, every motion deliberate. The crunch beneath his boots was brittle, old bone breaking after generations of silence. He crouched before the nearest skeleton. Its rib cage was collapsed inward, and the arms were crossed tightly over the knees, as though the person had died sitting upright, waiting. Carter murmured behind him, his voice low and hoarse. "Jesus Christ! How long do you think they've been here?" James's light swept across the rest of the chamber. There were more. Half a dozen, maybe more. Some slumped against the wall, others lying side by side on the ground. Between them lay the rusted remnants of lanterns, tools, tin containers, and a small wooden box that had half rotted into dust. On the opposite wall, Dark stains trailed upward where the stone was scarred by blunt strikes, marks left by desperate hands or tools that had struck until they could strike no more. He raised his flashlight higher. Near the upper edge of the chamber wall, faint carvings shimmered through the dust. He wiped the surface with his glove, revealing uneven letters scratched with trembling precision. "If you open this, tell them we waited." The words silenced even the sound of breathing. No one spoke. The phrase sat in the air like a prayer. James read it again and again, his throat tightening. The realization hit slowly. These people hadn't been buried by accident. They had been sealed. He looked closer at the inside of the stone barrier they'd broken through. The edges were smooth, the chisel marks cut from this side outward. The wall had been built from within. "They did it themselves," he whispered. "They closed it from inside." The men stared at him in disbelief. "You mean they trapped themselves?" Travis asked. James didn't answer. His light drifted over the skeletal remains again, over the tools and the scorch marks on the beams. In one corner, a cluster of stones was piled neatly, as though arranged deliberately. Beneath it glinted something metallic. He knelt, brushed the dust aside, and found an iron pickaxe head, its handle cleanly severed. The cut was too precise to be from decay. Someone had sawed it off. He understood then. Whoever had built that wall hadn't been trying to keep something out. They'd been forced to stay in. Their tools removed, their way out sealed. The betrayal was ancient, but its echo felt immediate. "Let's get out," he said finally. "Mark the site. No one touches anything until the inspectors come." His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of something raw in it, something close to grief. The men obeyed, moving carefully toward the exit, their lights flickering along the way. James followed last, turning once at the chamber's mouth. The beam of his flashlight swept over the carved message one final time. He whispered it under his breath as he turned away. They waited. Back in the open air, daylight felt unreal, almost intrusive. The fog had thinned, but the sky remained heavy with low clouds. The men removed their helmets, wiping dust and sweat from their faces. No one said a word. Even Larson, who usually filled every silence with orders, stood apart, smoking in quick, shallow drags. James sat on a crate near the generator, staring at the ground. The image of the skeletons, their hands folded, would not leave him. He thought of the grooves on the wall, of the sawed-off handles, of the message. These had been miners once. Men like them, trapped not by the earth, but by other hands. He tried to imagine their last hours, the slow fading of their lanterns, the final strikes against the ceiling, the realization that no one was coming. That night, the campfire burned lower than usual. The men spoke softly, if at all. Carter said he'd seen old mining records from the early 1800s mentioning a containment order after a cave-in somewhere near this range. The report had been vague, deliberately so. "Said the shaft was sealed indefinitely," he murmured. "No details, just gone from the books." James listened but didn't reply. He kept his eyes on the dark silhouette of the tunnel in the distance. The air above it shimmered faintly in the cold. The mountain had gone quiet again, but not with peace. It felt more like waiting. Later, in his cabin, James opened his notebook. His hands were still shaking slightly. He tried to write down everything he remembered: the number of bodies, the carvings, the condition of the tools, but the words blurred together. He stopped and stared at the page. The ink had smudged, the letters sinking into the paper like moisture absorbed by dust. Outside, the wind shifted direction, sweeping through the valley with a low, hollow sound. It passed through the tunnel mouth and out across the ridges, carrying with it the faint echo of something deeper, older, the memory of trapped voices, men who had died calling for help that never came. James closed his notebook and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the mountain breathe. He could almost hear them, not as ghosts, but as a silence that spoke. A silence that said, "We are still here." He didn't sleep. When dawn came, the fog was gone, but the mountain loomed heavier than ever, its flanks scarred by centuries of secrets. James knew that whatever they had found was only the beginning. The wall they'd broken through was not an end. It was a door, and beyond it lay the rest of the story, one carved into the very heart of the earth. Morning broke slowly over the Sierra Madre, the first light crawling across the peaks like a cautious intruder. Frost covered the camp, and the air was so cold that breath turned to white mist instantly. No one spoke much during breakfast. The sound of clattering metal trays felt too loud, too alive for what lay in their thoughts. The discovery of the chamber had left a weight on every man's shoulders, a pressure heavier than the mountain itself. The images of those skeletons huddled together, the carved words on the wall, the severed tools. It all hung between them like something sacred and unbearable. James Holden stood apart from the others, drinking coffee gone lukewarm. The wind whispered through the scaffolding, carrying the faint metallic tang from the tunnel mouth. The site had been officially closed for investigation, though the company's inspector wouldn't arrive for another 2 days. Until then, James had ordered the area sealed with tarps and marked with caution tape. But the men still avoided going near it, even to pass by. They said the air around that place felt wrong. Too cold, too still, like the inside of a tomb. Larson, true to his nature, wanted the work to continue on the secondary bore. "We can't afford to lose momentum," he said. "What's done is done. Let the historians deal with the bones." But James refused. He'd called the regional office himself the night before, his voice steady but insistent. "You'll want records, coordinates, and safety assessments," he told them. "This isn't a collapse. It's deliberate construction. You need the state involved." The line went quiet for a long moment before the voice on the other end replied, "Understood. Keep it contained." That phrase, "keep it contained," stuck in his head all morning. Contained was what had been done to those men, sealed alive for reasons lost to time. The words felt heavy, hypocritical, as if the world had not changed much at all. By mid-afternoon, James was already on the road to town. The nearest settlement lay 30 miles away, a dusty cluster of buildings at the foot of the mountains called Alva Junction. He drove alone in the company truck, the tires kicking up plumes of powdered frost behind him. The narrow dirt road wound through gorges and cliffs, following the old mining routes that had been carved into the range generations ago. As he descended, the air warmed slightly, though the unease in his chest did not. He reached the town near dusk. It looked like time had forgotten it. Wooden facades leaned under the weight of age, and the only open establishment was a small diner beside the general store. Inside, the heater hummed weakly, and a few locals sat scattered among the booths. James ordered black coffee and sat near the window, staring at the pale reflection of his face in the glass. When the waitress came by, he asked her if there was an archive or town hall nearby, any place that might have old records about the mines. She blinked at him, surprised. "Archives? Maybe the county office in Ridgeway, 50 miles west. Why?" He hesitated. "Just looking into the history up there. some of the old tunnels. Her expression shifted, cautious now. You mean the mountain tunnels? She asked, her voice lowering. I thought they stopped mining up there 100 years ago. Folks say the last company left in the early 1900s. That's what I'm trying to confirm, he said. When she left, one of the older men at the counter turned slightly toward him. His face was lined and pale, eyes sunken but sharp. You're with the drillers, aren't you? The man said, up near Black Hollow Ridge. James nodded slowly. Yes, you worked there? Long before your time, the man said. My grandfather did. He used to tell stories about a tunnel they closed before he was born. Said soldiers came up from the valley with wagons and sealed it shut. No one was supposed to ask why. James leaned forward. Soldiers? The old man shrugged. Maybe not soldiers exactly. Men in uniforms. He said they came after some kind of riot. There were escaped workers, maybe prisoners. The mine owner told the papers it was an accident, a cave-in. But my grandfather said it wasn't an accident at all. They found something in there, something that scared them. After that, they just buried it. James felt his pulse quicken. Did he ever say what they found? The man shook his head. No, just that it wasn't gold. That night, James stayed at a small motel outside town. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark. The idea that the seal had been made under orders, that men had been entombed alive not by chance but by choice, filled him with a growing sense of anger. He thought of the message carved into the wall. Tell them we waited. It was more than a plea. It was a testimony, a demand that someone, someday, would learn the truth. The next morning, he drove west to Ridgeway, the county seat. The building that housed the records office was small, its paint flaking and its windows streaked with dust. Inside, it smelled of paper and old wood. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes, listened to his request with mild curiosity. Mining records? That's ancient history, but you can try the archives in the basement. Downstairs, James found row after row of boxes stacked on metal shelves. Dust coated everything in a fine gray layer. He worked for hours, pulling out ledgers, maps, and yellowed documents until his fingers were black with age and ink. Most files were mundane. Wage records, supply inventories, accident logs. But one folder caught his eye. It bore the faded logo of the Black Hollow Mining Company, dated 1852. Inside were fragments, half-burned pages, memorandums, and a letter addressed to the company's founder. He read through them slowly, piecing together the story. There had been an uprising among the laborers, many of them indentured or formerly enslaved men brought in under contract. Conditions were brutal, wages non-existent. A group of workers had taken over one of the shafts and refused to leave, demanding freedom and safe passage out of the territory. The owner called in armed guards. The next documents were brief and formal. One page bore a single line, written in spidery ink. Containment authorized. No survivors expected. James sat back, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The phrasing chilled him. It was not the language of rescue or disaster. It was the language of execution. He found another note dated 2 weeks later, signed by a local official. All operations at Black Hollow are hereby suspended. The affected shaft is to be sealed indefinitely. All records related to the incident are to be removed from circulation by order of the board. He realized then that the wall they had broken through was not a natural barrier or even an accident of corporate negligence. It was a monument to deliberate silence. Those men had not simply died underground. They had been erased. By the time James left the building, dusk had settled again over the hills. He sat in the truck for a long time, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. A cold anger coiled in his chest. He imagined those men, trapped, waiting for help that would never come, carving their message into stone as the air thinned around them. They hadn't just wanted to be remembered. They wanted the truth to surface someday, like light breaking through rock. He returned to camp late that night. The fog had rolled in thick again, swallowing the valley in white. The men were asleep, the generators silent. James parked the truck and walked to the tunnel. The tarps over the entrance fluttered softly in the wind. He lifted one corner and looked into the darkness. The air that drifted out was colder than before, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt patient, as if the mountain itself was waiting for him to speak. He whispered into the void, "I know who you were." His voice trembled, but there was conviction in it. "And I'll make them remember." For a moment, nothing moved. Then the wind shifted, carrying his words back into the valley like an echo. The next morning, the crew found him already at work, cleaning the markings on the wall of the chamber. He documented everything: measurements, photographs, sketches. He worked with meticulous care, as though he were handling fragile bones. Larson arrived, furious that James was delaying the next phase of construction, but one look at his face stopped him from arguing. James's expression had changed. There was no fear left in it, only resolve. By evening, the valley glowed with a dying orange light. The peaks cast long shadows over the site, and the mountains seemed to breathe again, slow and deep. James stood by the sealed entrance, his notebook in hand, filled with the story he had uncovered. He knew that the company would try to bury it again, to label it an accident or a misunderstanding, but this time he would not let the truth be sealed away. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the ridges. For the first time since arriving, he felt that the mountain was no longer watching in silence. It was listening. The truth that had been buried for nearly 2 centuries was stirring again, and it had found its voice in him. In that moment, James understood that some graves could not be left closed, and some stories, no matter how deeply entombed, would always find their way back to the surface. The mountain was different now. It no longer felt merely like a landscape of stone and ice. It had become a vast, breathing thing that carried the weight of what had been uncovered. The wind moved through the valley with a deeper sound, a low murmur that seemed to echo against the walls of the tunnel even when the air was still. After the discovery of the documents and the confirmation of what had really happened inside that sealed chamber, James Holden could no longer look at the worksite as just a job. Each vibration of the machinery, each groan of the drills felt like a desecration. The truth was alive beneath them, and every strike of metal against rock was a wound reopened. The company, however, was impatient. Larson returned with new orders from Denver. Continue the excavation on the western side while the authorities handled the historical incident. They called it that now, an incident, as if it were a small administrative error buried in time. They wanted progress reports, footage of the operation, proof that production hadn't stopped. Larson barked orders at the crew with forced enthusiasm, but it was clear that even he was uneasy. The men followed reluctantly, moving slower than before, eyes always flicking towards the sealed passage as though expecting it to breathe again. James worked in silence, but not on the tasks Larson demanded. Each day he recorded everything he could: measurements of the tunnel walls, temperature fluctuations, air pressure readings. He took photos of the carvings and notes on the peculiar density of the rock. At night, he typed up his observations in a small digital recorder, his voice low and deliberate. They were buried alive, he would say into the static hum, not by the earth, but by men who feared them more than they feared what they'd done. This mountain remembers, even if we forget. The days blended together in a rhythm of exhaustion and unease. Strange things began to happen in the camp. Equipment failed without explanation. Lights flickered even when the generators ran smoothly. The men complained that they heard noises inside the tunnel when no one was working. A faint tapping, the metallic scrape of tools against stone. James didn't dismiss it anymore. He'd stopped trying to rationalize everything that couldn't be explained. The mountain was speaking in its own language, and he had started to understand fragments of it. One evening, after a particularly long shift, he walked alone to the sealed passage. The air was still, colder than outside, as if the space itself drew warmth away from whoever entered. He sat down on the ground opposite the sealed wall, the light from his headlamp spreading weakly across the gray surface. He thought about the men who had died behind it, men who had once laughed, cursed, dreamed of freedom. He imagined them realizing one by one that no rescue was coming. He imagined the last one still awake when the air thinned, carving the message with trembling hands. Tell them we waited. The silence around him deepened until he could hear his own pulse. Then, faintly, a sound reached him, a low vibration, almost imperceptible, like something moving far below. He knew it wasn't possible, but for a moment he thought he heard breathing. He closed his eyes, and instead of fear he felt something like sorrow, not for himself, but for them, for the injustice that had been hidden so carefully under the pretense of progress. He whispered, "I'll tell them." When he returned to camp, the others were restless. Travis said one of the oxygen monitors in the secondary shaft had gone haywire, dropping to 0 before resetting. Carter claimed he'd seen dust moving inside the tunnel even though the air was still. "It's like the whole place is alive," he muttered. "It's watching." No one laughed. No one told him he was imagining things. The mountain had stripped them of their skepticism. Over the next days, the noises grew louder. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was murmuring, a kind of rhythm that pulsed through the walls, faint but deliberate. When the drills were on, the sound vanished, swallowed by the machinery. But when the power cut off, when the generators cooled and the night settled over the valley, the whispers returned. The men began to leave their cabins lit at all hours. Sleep became rare, and tempers frayed. Larson blamed James. He accused him of feeding the fear, of spreading nonsense among the workers. "You think this is a haunting?" he snapped one night, his face flushed with anger. "You're a driller, Holden, not a priest. We're here to dig rock, not chase ghosts." James didn't argue. He simply looked at him, calm and expressionless. "Sometimes rock remembers more than we do," he said quietly. Larson turned away, muttering under his breath, but the words stayed with him. The company sent a new shipment of explosives for the western expansion. When James saw the crates marked with the red triangle, the same symbol they had found in the sealed chamber, something inside him twisted. He remembered how the old miners' records had mentioned containment by detonation. He wondered if history was about to repeat itself, just in another form. He approached Larson the next morning. "We shouldn't use them here," he said. "The mountain's unstable. There's trapped air pockets, possibly gas." Larson brushed him off. "You're imagining things again. Get back to work." That night, the sound returned louder than ever. It wasn't coming from the sealed chamber anymore. It was coming from beneath the new bore. James woke to the vibrations shaking his cabin lightly, as though the ground itself were sign and protest. He stepped outside, pulling on his jacket, and saw that several men were already standing near the tunnel, flashlights cutting through the fog. The ground trembled once, sharply, then stopped. In the silence that followed, they all heard it. 3 distinct knocks from deep below, echoing through the rock. The same rhythm he'd heard in his dream weeks ago. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, from somewhere far down the mountain, a sound like a distant rumble rose and faded. James felt the hair on the back of his neck stand. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something older, a shift, as if the mountain were changing position in its sleep. The next morning, the fog didn't lift. It clung to the camp in thick bands, muffling every sound. The air tasted metallic. James found himself pacing along the edge of the site, his thoughts circling like vultures. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being warned. The deeper they dug, the more agitated the mountain became. It wasn't superstition, it was instinct. The land was alive, reacting. He thought of the men who had died here before, of their desperate carving, their message to those who would come after. Maybe this was how memory worked in the earth. It didn't vanish, it waited to be remembered. He began to write at night, filling his notebook with everything he knew. Not just facts and measurements, but thoughts, connections, the story as it truly was. He wrote until his hand cramped, until his lamp guttered low. He wanted a record that couldn't be erased, a testimony for whoever would one day find this place again. If the company tried to silence him, the story would already exist somewhere beyond their reach. The tension in the camp reached its breaking point a week later. During a late shift, one of the drills jammed suddenly, its motor whining before bursting into flames. No one was hurt, but the explosion shattered the remaining calm. Larson blamed the crew blamed the equipment, and James watched it all from the sidelines, feeling the weight of inevitability pressing down. The mountain had been patient, but even patience had its limits. That night, as the fires were extinguished and silence settled again, James stood near the sealed chamber for what he knew might be the last time. He rested his hand against the cold stone, feeling the faint vibration beneath it. It was steady now, rhythmic, like a pulse. The air around him was still, yet it carried a quiet presence as though unseen eyes watched him through the darkness. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "You've waited long enough. They can't bury you again." The wind stirred slightly, brushing across his face, and for a brief moment he thought he heard words in it. Not speech exactly, but the suggestion of it, the echo of voices from deep within the mountain. He couldn't make out what they said, but he understood the feeling behind it. Acknowledgement. Gratitude. He left the tunnel then, walking back toward the camp, his boots crunching against the frost. Behind him, the mountain loomed in silence, vast and unknowable. He didn't look back again. He didn't need to. Something had shifted. The truth was no longer buried, not completely. It was alive now, carried in him in the air, in the trembling of the earth itself. Sleep found him late that night, but it was deep and dreamless. The mountain, for the first time in weeks, was quiet. The silence it left behind was not the stillness of fear, but something gentler, almost like rest. Yet beneath that calm, James could still feel the faint hum through the ground, constant and enduring, the silence that speaks when no one else will. The last week on the site unfolded in a kind of suspended calm, as though time itself had slowed to watch. The fog had finally lifted from the valley, revealing the full breadth of the Sierra Madre peaks in the hard morning light. Snow streaked their ridges like veins of white marble, and the air was so clear that sound traveled for miles. Yet, even in that stillness, something in the mountain felt different. Emptied, perhaps, or simply at peace after what it had endured. The crew was packing up, their contract completed, their machinery being hauled down the narrow access road that wound through the canyons. What had begun as an excavation project had become something else entirely, an unplanned unearthing of history, a revelation that none of them would forget. James Holden was the last one left overseeing the dismantling of the equipment. Larson had already departed 3 days earlier, summoned to Denver for debriefings and press meetings. The company had lost its appetite for expansion. The project was being reevaluated. The word sounded hollow to James. They would dress the truth in bureaucracy, coded in phrases like historical sensitivity and public safety, but he knew what it meant. They had found something they could not control, and now they wanted distance from it. He spent his days walking the site in silence, checking the final reinforcements, ensuring that the sealed chamber was properly marked and recorded. The official reports described it clinically. Human remains dated to mid-19th century, evidence of confinement, pending state historical protection. But no words could capture the feeling of standing in that place, knowing that beneath his boots lay men who had once fought to live another hour, another breath. The thought had rooted itself deep inside him. He could not shake the sense that they were still here, not as spirits, but as memory itself, the memory of injustice made tangible in stone. The morning the state engineers arrived to pour the final closure seal, the sky was cloudless and pale. Trucks rumbled up the ridge, carrying concrete and steel reinforcement. They worked methodically, speaking little. When the time came, James stood a short distance away as the final mixture was poured into the mouth of the old shaft. The sound was steady and unhurried, the concrete spreading into the hollow like a gray tide. It was not the first time this mountain had been sealed, but this time it was done with reverence, not fear. He remembered the words carved inside the chamber. "Tell them we waited." He had told them. He had given interviews to journalists, shared his notes, handed over the documents he'd uncovered in Ridgeway. The story was already spreading beyond the company's control. Historians were calling it one of the darkest industrial crimes in early frontier history. Descendants of the mining families had begun to reach out, tracing names that had vanished from records more than a century ago. Some of them had wept when they spoke to him. "They weren't forgotten," one woman told him over the phone. "You brought them back." Now, as he watched the final section of the shaft being sealed, James felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. Closure was a word people liked to use in moments like this, but he understood now that closure was an illusion. The past never truly closed. It only shifted deeper into the layers of memory. The mountain would hold it differently now, not as a wound, but as a scar, visible, enduring, and finally acknowledged. When the machinery shut down for the last time, silence flooded the valley again. The workers removed their helmets, heads bowed briefly before dispersing. James lingered long after they left, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The wind picked up, threading through the pines, carrying with it the scent of resin and cold stone. For the first time since he had arrived months ago, he didn't feel the mountain pressing against him. The tension that had haunted the air was gone. What remained was stillness, vast and solemn. He walked to the new memorial site where a dark granite plaque had been set into the rock at the base of the ridge. It was simple, without ornamentation, its inscription chosen from the words he'd written in his report, "To the men who waited in darkness. You are not forgotten." Small offerings already dotted the ground around it, flowers, candles, and a few miners' lamps, their glass catching the afternoon light. He knelt briefly, brushing his fingers across the cool surface. It felt almost like skin, cold but alive beneath his touch. When he rose, the sun was beginning to sink behind the peaks. The light turned amber, washing the valley in gold. Shadows stretched long across the ground, reaching toward the plaque and the sealed entrance beyond. He stood there, hands in his pockets, and listened to the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees. For a moment, it sounded like a voice. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried something gentle, something like gratitude. He smiled faintly. "You can rest now," he whispered. He walked slowly back toward the camp where the last of the trucks were being loaded. The road ahead wound downward through the gorge, a ribbon of dirt disappearing into the distance. It would take him several hours to reach the nearest town, but he wasn't in a hurry. He wanted to take one last look at everything. The scaffolding half disassembled, the footprints fading into dust, the ridges glowing in the sunset. This place had taken something from him, but it had given him something too, a sense of purpose that went beyond any job or paycheck. As he drove down the mountain later that evening, the radio in the truck stayed off. The silence felt cleaner now, no longer heavy. The headlights illuminated the twisting road, and through the open window came the scent of pine and the faint chill of snow. The air was thin but alive, like breath exhaled after a long sleep. He looked once in the rearview mirror. The mountain stood massive against the fading sky, its peaks already lost in shadow. A single streak of light lingered on the slope, catching the outline of the memorial. For a fleeting second, it looked as though the mountain itself were glowing from within. Night fell quickly. The stars emerged in clusters, bright and close, as if leaning down to listen. James felt the quiet settle inside him like warmth spreading through his chest. He thought about all the places he'd worked before. The noise, the exhaustion, the indifference of men chasing profit through stone. This place was different. It had demanded something from him, something personal, and in return it had given him truth. When he reached the base of the valley, he pulled over and stepped out of the truck. The road was empty, the air sharp and still. Above him, the mountain loomed vast and dark, its ridges silhouetted against the stars. He stood there for a long time, his breath rising in clouds. The silence wasn't complete anymore. It had texture now, a subtle hum that felt alive. He realized it wasn't the sound of the earth moving, nor of wind or water. It was the memory of what the mountain had held, still resonating faintly through stone. He thought of the men in the chamber, of their final hours and their quiet endurance. He thought of the words he'd carved into his own report, the same ones he had spoken aloud in that darkness. We came back. That was all they had wanted, to be remembered, to have someone return and listen. The rest was beyond human power to mend. James got back into the truck and started the engine. The sound was soft against the vastness of the landscape. As he began to drive again, the lights from the mountain faded behind him, swallowed by distance. But in his mind, he could still see the ridge line, could still feel that faint breath of wind that seemed to follow him down the road. He didn't know if he would ever come back here. Perhaps one day, years from now, others would visit the memorial, leaving flowers or tracing the engraved words with their fingertips. Maybe someone would read his notes or watch the footage from the excavation and feel the same pull he had felt, the pull of something buried too long beneath silence. And maybe they would understand that history is not a straight line but a circle, and that every truth eventually finds a way to breathe again. When he reached the junction that led toward the open highway, he stopped once more. Behind him, the wind rose gently through the pines, carrying a sound so faint it could have been imagined. It wasn't the moan of machinery or the whistle of air through stone. It was softer than that, like a sigh of release. He whispered, "Good night," and turned onto the road. The headlights stretched ahead into darkness, cutting through the night like twin veins of light. As he drove away, the mountain stood unmoving, its face bathed in starlight. For a long time, nothing stirred. Then, high on the ridge, the wind shifted once more, moving through the trees in a low, rhythmic pattern, almost like breath. The mountain exhaled. The sound carried down into the empty valley and faded slowly into peace. The earth had closed its mouth again, but this time it was not in secrecy. It was in rest. The mountain, at last, was breathing freely. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now, because even darker discoveries are coming next. Don't miss what's buried in the next video. And if you think the truth should be seen, share this story with someone who needs to know what really lies beneath.